So there was the Umayyads at one time, like in ruling like the Islamic Empire at that time, and after the Abbasid revolution, the Abbasids took over. So at the time of Umayyads, they did like a magnificent like expansion. Like there was Qutayba
Yes.
bin Bahali going on in Central Asia. There was Muhammad ibn Qasim like going on in Hindustan, and there was Tariq and Musa in Al Andalus, and and in Abbasid period, we don't see similar kind of expansion, but we do see like a lot of work being done, like which is also being called like the Nishad-Sani of Islam or the Renaissance of Islam.
Mhm.
Tell us a bit about that. How they were
Uh,
different, like in their approach.
the Umayyads were very different than the Abbasids were. The Umayyads were what you can call Arab supremacists. They believed in Arabs having all the power. And Arabs at this time, Arab Muslims at this time, constituted maybe 5% of the population. They built these cities like Fustat in Egypt, Kufa in Iraq. They built these cities and they ruled these sort of military garrisons. They ruled out of these, and for them, expansion was the goal because expansion created wealth that fed the empire. So they unleashed these capable generals on Hindustan and Spain. But with the Abbasids came to power not on the shoulders of Arabs, but on the shoulders of Persians. So this empire was more focused on creating an empire where everybody has an equal opportunity in the military, in the political machinery. So this brought more diversity to the court, new ideas, Persian ideology, Byzantine ideology, the way that they ruled, the way that their ideas, the Greek, for example, a lot of Greek influence came into the Abbasid court, Indian influence came into the Abbasid court. So they ruled very differently. And for the Abbasids, I think they understood that their empire was overstretched. If they wanted to expand into India or to try to conquer Spain again, they would not be able to do that. That would just be a waste of resources, and those resources they spent on strengthening the core of their empire, which unfortunately did not do them that much good. But they did, like they created the Golden Age, they created the House of Wisdom. They understood that they wanted the Arabs. I think I personally, when I studied them, I feel this way, that they felt that Arabs were sort of a backwater civilization, and they wanted to catch up to these giants to the north, the Byzantines, the Romans, and the Persians. So they started the Golden Age of Islam. They started collecting books. They started translating things rather than focus on expansion. They created an actual stable empire, which, by the way, its successor states were strong as well, because the Abbasids, they had focused on developing that empire. They had the Burid postal system, which like when I think Harun al-Rashid died, they could carry mail like 2,000 kilometers in a few days. They had an established military system. They had palace cities. They had good irrigation systems, all of which they had taken, like the irrigation system they had taken from the Nabateans and the Romans. And so like they had taken from all these civilizations, but they had built a very stable, very good empire that was more like with the Umayyad Caliphate. You can sort of tell that it's going to falter the way that it was structured, but the Abbasids, they started to really create a system of governance in the Islamic world, which everybody later on used, the Iqta system as it's called.
But don't you think this is actually the historical process? Like there is one generation which actually expands the civilization, then there is another generation which actually brings that civilization, and then there comes the last generation which actually kinds of like is the bringer of doom and gloom.
I think that worked, the Asabi, the cycle of empires. I think that works more for empires than it works for um, than it works for, let's say, civilizations. Although in this case it kind of works because, yeah, we have the Arabs, they expanded the empire and then they faltered, and then the Turks came in and they expanded the Islamic world and then they faltered. But I think that works better for empires. Like, yeah, one generation built the empire, then the next. But in this case, like Umayyads, they did not actually have to die out so quickly. They could have worked multiple ways, but they just chose not to. They just wanted to be Arab supremacists.
But like as we see, like in 1258 when Hulagu Khan came and they sacked Baghdad. Like, does the Muslim civilization never recovered from that incident?
Mhm.
Is that like, is that historically correct? Like that one event actually changed the historical dimensions of like the Islamic civilization?
It was a huge shock to the Islamic world. And yeah, of course, every single, I think, event that happened it changed. But when I think it was in 1348 or so, that like only 100 years after Baghdad was sacked, that Ibn Battuta went through the city, and he mentions a very beautiful, prosperous, incredible city. And this was not even a capital at the time. It was just a secondary city of the Ilkhanate, the Mongol successor state. And I don't think it's fair to say that Baghdad never recovered from it, but Baghdad did lose its importance as the Abbasid Caliphate died. It was not a capital anymore. But the Mongols, for example, the Mongols did give, as much as they slaughtered the Islamic civilization, they did give Islam some things. But yeah, from around 1200 to around 1400, the Islamic world was in a you can say that it was a civilization under siege. In the West, you were seeing Muslims being pushed off the Iberian Peninsula with the fall of Cordoba in 1236, fall of Sevilla in 1248, and then the final push in 1492. And then in the Middle East, you're seeing first the Mongols, then Temur, and then you have this fractured empire. And then around the year 1500, the Islamic world began to be put together again. You have the Ottomans were starting to unite Anatolia, pick up huge chunks of Eastern Europe, and they pick up most of the holy cities and most of the Middle East. And then you have Iran being united by the Safavids, and then India being united by the Mongols. You have Central Asia being united by Shaybani Khan and other Mongols. So at this point, like for those something like 300 years, Islam was under civilization. It was a watershed moment which shifted Islam from the Arab civilization to the Turkic civilization, the Persian Turkic civilization.
No,
And
but like,
without
I would like to raise one point, but like that Renaissance actually never came back. Like even if we see the 16th century, we see Suleiman the Magnificent in Ottoman Empire, we see Akbar the Great in Hindustan. There were Safavid empires, like these were like huge, glorious empires. But like within a few centuries, they crumbled away, and all of us like we became colonial subjects. Don't you think that Renaissance actually never came back? And these like Mughals, like what have they done in India or Hindustan? Like, okay, beautiful architecture, beautiful buildings, but they never like did like anything with technology or science or universities. Neither the Ottomans did that.
in terms of, by Renaissance, you mean scientific Renaissance, right?
Yes, yes.
Uh, to say that before the 1248 the Renaissance actually was there is also sort of not a wrong statement, I guess, to make, because it had, by that point, it had dwindled as well. But yes, when these three giant empires came into existence, they were not exactly focused on science. But there was some work still being done, mainly in the field of military technology. We don't give them enough credit, but like at the time, the guns, I mentioned this in one of my videos, that at the time the guns that were being made in Goa were of superior quality than the guns being made in Germany. At the time, Germany was the leader in producing guns. But yes, the Turks were not exactly as focused on bringing back bringing sort of this technological era that the Arabs had been focused on. So that, I think, can be attributed to a couple of things. With the Abbasids, the Abbasids had an incredible amount of wealth, first of all, which was unnatural at the time. They were all of the world was like, all of the Islamic world was sort of united under them. So, and all the trade that flowed between India, China, Europe, and the Middle East flowed through Baghdad. So Baghdad was crazy rich. But also, yes, the willingness of rulers to build universities and to do these things is also a very important point. The Turks simply did not have that. It maybe is a cultural thing to a large extent. The fact that they did not build universities, even though Europe at the time was building universities, but couple of factors. I think that if the Islamic world was a little bit more fractured, if like everything from Anatolia, from Constantinople to Dhaka and Bengal were not united under just three empires, we would have seen more work being done with more competition. But competition had died out. These three empires were expanding, but they were very stale. They were not really doing that much. Once they were established, their borders were not changing all that much. In 1689, when the Ottomans failed the siege of Vienna, that was a turning point for Islamic history. At that time, you have the failed siege of Vienna, you have the Ottomans starting to decline. Just 20 years later, Aurangzeb dies and the Mughals start to decline. And then you have a couple of years before that, you have Nadir Shah taking control of Iran. So the Safavids began to die out. And so around the year 1700, coincidentally, maybe it was a coincidence, maybe it wasn't, maybe I'm not saying that, but these three empires were in decline. And for 100 years, Muslims actually did not understand that they were in decline. They did not realize that our dominance had been broken. A lot of them, for example, looked at the printing press not with like skepticism towards science, but rather as a useless invention. We're at top. They believed that they were at top, and actually they were at the top. And they just, within 100 years, they were just so left behind by colonial gold that was coming into Europe, and they simply just when in 1798 Napoleon attacked Egypt and he conquered it within minutes, within basically minutes. That's when Muslims realized that they had fallen, and at that point it was like too late to do anything. Within like 30 for 50 years of that, basically all of the Islamic world was now under European control. So I think the Muslims just simply did not get the chance to wait and reevaluate themselves. And yes, the Turks, they should have put more emphasis on education, but yeah, simply didn't.
What do you think was the biggest reason? I was talking to Dr. Hood Bhai in the first episode, and I asked a similar question to him as well, that he was saying, like, he also wrote like one of the articles as well, that it was actually the lack of the intellectual curiosity which was the reason of the decline of these two magnificent empires, the Ottomans and the Mughals in Hindustan.
He also blamed Al-Ghazali for that. That's a point that I very strongly disagree with.
Okay, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that first, and then we can come back to this thing as well.
Okay, I don't think that intellectual curiosity, I think, exists in every civilization, but there were a couple of problems, and this is a very contemporary problem as well. When you look at, for example, Spain, you see that when Spain became vulnerable to Christian attacks, most Al-Andalus became vulnerable to Christian attacks, people started to leave. And they started to leave and they moved to Morocco and Tunisia. And actually there we saw a small golden age. We actually saw people who were developing things, who were building things, who were doing research, and they were actually able to defeat the giant Portuguese empire. A king of Portugal died in Morocco. They were also when lithographic printing came together, they were also very quick to adopt that. So we did saw, but I don't know why we don't give them enough credit for that. We did see a little golden age there. Similarly, when the Mongols attacked, they killed so many people for 200 years. You can see that for 200 years, we are seeing conqueror after conqueror coming in and destroying important cities. In 1350, Damascus and Baghdad were the world's capitals in printing, in making paper. Every single sheet of paper that was being used in Europe was being produced in either Damascus or Baghdad. But then Temur came along and he burned both these cities. So we had, for 200 years, we had infrastructural decline, complete infrastructural decline, population decline, and then we also had the Black Death during this period. So overall, this huge 300 years of instability led to this problem. You can blame Al-Ghazali if you want, but Al-Ghazali was not as influential as we want to think that he was. He died, I think, in 1061 or so. But then for 200 years after that, we did see the Golden Age existing, and then we did see it sort of coming back in smaller portions in Morocco, in to some extent India, and in the Ottoman Empire. So we did see it. Al-Ghazali was not as influential as a lot of people like to think that he was. Secondly, okay, what was the second point? I forgot. Anyhow,
Okay, like the one thing I would like to say here as well, like the sack of Baghdad, it was the biggest massacre in human history till the siege of Stalingrad by the Nazis.
yeah, something like that. Like the numbers are not sure. We don't really have actual numbers, so we can say something like that.
Yeah, I mean, like it's also like legends and myths as well that
Yeah,
that
a
they
lot of them.
books like in the river, and the river of the Euphrates became actually like black
Black.
of
Yeah.
the ink from that from those books.
Yeah, the scale of the massacre was by no means small, and the infrastructural damage that it did. For example, the rivers were the canals that fed most of the area around Iraq were destroyed, and there was no. You can imagine how agriculture. This was a region that was sort of the breadbasket of the Middle East, and then all of a sudden there was no agriculture there. So a lot of things contributed to this. This was a horrible time to exist in the Islamic world. And then the Turks came along with the Mughals in India and Safavids. Well, Safavids were not exactly Turks, but them in Iran. And then they did not focus on universities, building universities. I don't know why exactly that was. I mean, with printing press, we know that they were, first of all, they thought that they had no need for a printing press. And secondly, the religious establishment and the other political establishment was scared that, they had seen the Protestant Reformation in Europe, and they were afraid that something like that might happen in the Islamic world. And, the powerful people, they were afraid of losing power. So that's one of the reasons. But I think that maybe the printing press would have been could have contributed to it. Obviously, it did contribute. But what I don't understand is why no universities. We did see universities being built before the civilization under siege era. I really don't know why there were no universities being built. I have no idea why that is. I'm trying to understand that.
So there was a different perspective. Like recently, there is a Turkish professor Ahmed Kuru. Like he published his book like 3 years back, yeah, Islam and the Ulema Alliance and the kings in Islam. And he argues that it was actually like somewhere around like 12th, 13th century. That was the period when the Renaissance of the Muslim Golden Age supposedly ended. That
Mm-hmm.
there was a shift in the political structures of Islam, that the kings who were ruling were in alliance with the merchants or the traders at that time. And after that period, we see gradually the rise of the clergy, and that place of the merchant or the trader was taken over by ulema, by the Maulvi, by the religious clergy at that time. And that was a watershed movement as well, a moment as well in Islamic history. Because afterwards, what happened afterwards was just like the how do you call it, like that rolling ball effect, like the
Yeah,
snowball effect.
snowball effect. To some extent, yes. For example, the Ottomans, they agree. Or for example, even in like when Muhammad II attacked Constantinople, he consulted the stars before he attacked, and this is something that is obviously banned in Islam. And still, because the Turks and their religion and their previous religion had guided so much of their culture, that is also one of the reasons that they did not pay emphasis on education, but rather on training. I mean, they did run one of the biggest empires in world history and a very successful empire, so they did pay emphasis on that. Not on educating people for sciences and stuff like that, but mainly about on educating them for bureaucracy, new kinds of rule and governance. They did align with clergy very much, but can you really say that for the Mughals, or can you really say that for the Mongols, or even the Ottomans? The Ottomans did, like, they were in love with Ibn Arabi and all that, but I don't think that you can actually generalize that too much and say that they align themselves with the clergy more than the merchant class. I mean, of course, the one of the biggest jobs of the Mughal emperor and the Safavid Shah was to keep the trade route and the pilgrimage roads clear, and when they failed to do that, they always saw revolts. So like no king who was not terribly drunk has ever abandoned the merchant class, because they bring money, they do a lot of things. Clergy, yeah, you can say that, but not exactly in the same way.
No, no, I'm not saying that like they totally like abandoned the merchant class, but what I'm saying is like as we see in the Ottoman Empire, when the printing press was invented, it was the Grand Mufti of the Ottoman Empire who actually issued a religious decree, a fatwa, that this is haram to publish like books on this printing press. Or I don't know. You also said like you also made one videos on that, and you mentioned it was only the religious books, and it's also like kind of a myth that it was said about all the books. But the other thing is like in Hindustan, as we see, Aurangzeb, like he had like a religious outlook that even now the history we read about him, that okay, he was selling hats and making money out of that. He was translating Quran, and like he had a religious outlook.
He did have a religious outlook, but to say that he was aligning himself with clergy is too simplistic, at least for him, because I know him. At least for him, it's too simplistic to say that, because he did at the same time. His mentor, Raja Raghunath, was a Hindu, and a lot of Hindus were in his court. And on one occasion, he actually had his grand Qadi. There was this rebellion in which both Muslim and Hindu soldiers were involved, and his grand Qadi said that we should kill the Hindus and forgive the Muslims. And he said, what business does that have to do with religion? They revolted. This is treason, and I'm going to kill them all. So I don't think that you can actually say that they were aligning themselves. I don't think that there were a larger number of clergy at the court than there was during Akbar's era. He was religious, but to say that clergy was influencing Mughal affairs at this time, I really would not agree with that. I think that that's just sort of this sort of our go-to narrative again and again for the decline of science and education. We always tend to blame the clergy, but the clergy was actually, on many points, it was not exactly as influential as we usually think it was. Like, for example, was the clergy, did Al-Mansur not try to align with Imam Abu Hanifa, or did Al-Mamun not try to win over Ibn Hanbal? They did try to get the clergy on their side as well. Everybody did try that, but some succeeded, some didn't.
Uh-huh. Okay, moving forward, like you mentioned like a couple of minutes ago, the Andalusian civilization, or there was like a small golden age in Andalusia at that time as well. So, I mean, there is claim both from the Christian historians, and there is also from the Muslim historians as well, that the Andalusian civilization was a very tolerant civilization, and there was a one period in human history at that time where Christians, Muslims, and Jews, they were all living together in harmony and peace. Or as the some like Christian historians, they say like no, there were genocides, and it was not all good and happy like at that time. But tell us something about that.
I was in Spain last week, actually, and what I saw there, the way that they have sort of integrated their Islamic or Arab heritage into their culture, it is truly amazing. To say that there were genocides or stuff like that, there were incidents of interreligious conflict, but exactly, it wasn't exactly a state policy. We did see Jews, for example, very much integrated into the Islamic society in Cordoba. Christians, there were some revolts from Christians where Christians were killed. There was this one, I don't remember the guy's name, but he sort of protested against Islamic rule by going to a mosque and yelling out slurs at the Prophet. And at his trial, the Qadi actually told him to just apologize and walk away. There would be no punishment if you just apologize. But no, he just wanted to go down in history pages as the martyr, and so he refused to do that. So he was executed. But in general, there was a lot of tolerance during the Caliphate of Cordoba period. After that came the Almoravids, and then the Almohad. And during those periods, there wasn't exactly all that as much tolerance as had been during the Cordoba era. So you can find not exactly genocides on a large scale, to be honest, but you can find intolerance a bit. But then again, the Almohad were intolerant against everybody who spoke out against them. Like, for example, Ibn Rushd, Averroes, he had a trial against him. So the Almohad were intolerant, but they were intolerant to everyone. They killed so many fellow Muslims that you can fill an entire history book with the list of people that they killed, tribes that they basically eradicated.
Uh-huh. Okay. And there is this thing also, like over there, like in history, people usually mention like one or two events as like the watershed moments or like the turning points of the history. As a historian, what do you think about that? Like, so I will like mention here like two specific events like in history, like one like Charles Martel and the Battle of Tours in 730.
Mhm.
Christian historians, they call him the savior of Western civilization and Christianity. And there is another event like the Battle of Anjalut, which like so many people say
Yeah.
actually saved Islam when Mamluks fought against the Mongols. What do you think about this?
Both of those events, I think watershed moments hardly ever come down to one battle.
Mm,
Uh, in terms of Ain Jalut, there was no way that the Mongols could have actually attacked Egypt. They could have actually like attacked Egypt, but they wouldn't have been able to conquer Egypt. When Halagu Khan came to attack Baghdad, he had 300 he had 100,000 soldiers, and every soldier had like 2 or 3 horses with him, uh, which like he was to ride one and then eat the rest on his journey. This army of 300 or 400,000 people, wherever they went, they changed ecosystems there. They fed on so much grass and so much land that they just changed. Imagine such a huge caravan traveling. And the problem was that after Baghdad, they would have had trouble attacking Egypt because they would have had to cross this huge desert, and any army that was small enough to cross the desert would not have been able to face the Mamluks. So it is it's not that the battle itself changed too much, but rather the battle marks a point. It was the first point, was the beginning of the end for the Mongols, basically you could say. And same for Tor. Tor did not itself change as much as we think it did, but it marks a point with the rise of the Carolingians in France and the sort of the beginning of the end for the Umayyads. If the Muslims had won at Tor, it's likely that Charles Martel would have died, and so we would not have had Charlemagne. European history would have been very different.
mhm.
But but would the Muslims have been able to control it? I don't think so. Um, have you? If you've been to like southern France, you don't see any semblance of any Islamic civilization there. Narbonne was under Islamic control for something like 50 years. Aquitaine, most of Aquitaine was under Islamic control for like 50 years. But we don't see any semblance there because the Muslims would not have been able to hold on to that region. Muslims were not able to hold on to Italy. Muslims were not able to hold on to Switzerland. This part of Europe, they simply could not have been able to hold on to. So I don't think that European history would have been like, it would have been different, but I don't think that it would have been Muslim today. Like Edward Gibbon says that we would be teaching the Quran in Oxford today if the Muslims had won the Battle of Tor. That really would not have happened. Edward Gibbons is exaggerating the importance of that battle very much.
Or rather than that, if I would say like if the first siege of Constantinople, because like for years it was Constantinople which actually protected the Europe. If the
Yeah,
first siege of Constantinople would have been a successful siege, I mean, would we have been
that
like, as Edward Gibbons said, like would they have been teaching Quran at the Oxford?
uh that's an interesting question. Um, at that point, we could have reasonably saw Muslims enter Eastern Europe. But to go as far as Germany or France, that seems very unlikely that the Muslims would have been able to hold on to hold on to actually that region, because the Christian rule and Muslim rule were fundamentally very different. In the Islamic world, you had this elite class of warriors. They kept power, and that's the reason that we did not have democracy, could not develop in the Islamic world. In the East, in the West, you saw power was more divided. You had a king who was relying on his vassals, dukes and counts and all that, and they were supplying them with men, and those men were from that very country. So everybody was connected to the land that they were defending, and the king was relying on these people physically for them to fight. And what that did was also develop a spirit of like being a warrior in these European peasants. Whereas in the Islamic world, you had an elite class of warriors, which in many cases was a slave army, like we saw in India, we saw in Baghdad, we saw in everywhere, basically Spain, everywhere. And the people were simply not prepared. The people who were defending the land were not connected to the land. And they were reliant on the king only for money. So as long as the king paid them, the king had absolute power. So we could not have democracy develop in our part of the world, and the people were not prepared to take on a challenge without a central authority. As soon as in Europe, when central authority died out, locals rallied and they were able to put up a defense. But in the Islamic world, that never happened because the locals simply did not have the equipment, the spirit, or the training to do that, because they were not defending themselves. They were previously being defended by a rich patron who is no longer there.
Okay, like I would like to something just came to my mind, and I would like to ask this as well. Do you think that we look at history from a very Eurocentric point of view, and that the history we read today is like it's like a story being told to us by Westerners? In this story, we look at Alexander, who sacked the glorious cities of Persepolis and Thebes as a hero, and we look at Genghis Khan, like, who was from the east, as a barbarian, as a killer, like, who also conquered, who was a glorious conqueror as well.
I think in the recent
Alexander is a hero and Genghis is a villain in our history.
Yeah, they were both villains. But in the recent years, we've seen this sort of I think the Western historians have become more objective, to be honest. And I appreciate that about them, that the great man history is not anymore being taught. They don't look at Alexander as the great conqueror anymore. At the very least, they are neutral about that. They consider him, and that's I was reading in the book that I mentioned earlier, in Defense of History, the guy had said that to be objective, it takes time. At this point in time, in the year 2022, we can actually not be objective about Hitler or the Armenian genocide because they're recent. They are still being, they're still impacting the people around us. But we can be objective about the massacre of Baghdad or the siege of Constantinople, whatever, because because that was so long ago. So I think that a lot of historians there is a lot of Eurocentric bias, don't get me wrong, but the great man history is out now. People are looking at Genghis Khan with more nuance, and also Alexander as more nuance. You've seen Columbus has sort of fallen from the pedestal. So a lot of people we're sort of reevaluating history now. The colonial look, or as people call it, as Edward Said called it, the Orientalist history is on its way out now. So Temur, for example, is another figure that is being looked at with nuance. We are actually the ones who are sort of stuck at great man, good or villain, good or bad. But European historians are now looking at things in a bit of a different way. When you read, for example, John Mann's The Mongol Empire, or Justin Morozzi's Tamerlane, you see that they have tried to present both sides. He does not pass judgments on him being a monster. I am not as good of a historian as he is. I do pass judgments, but a lot of historians don't do that anymore.
No, but like you mentioned this one point, like historical revisionism, and there is something similar going on in India right now. That they are trying to rename the cities, that Allahabad is not Allahabad anymore, and it's Prayagraj. I think correctly, Prayagraj. And they are trying to change the name of some other cities. There is Aurangabad, and they are trying to rebuild some of their lost temples that supposedly some Muslims built mosque upon.
Yes.
What do you think about that? Is that not historical revisionism?
That is very much a historical revision. Like I said, that we're still guilty of that. I think Europeans are not as guilty of that anymore. But about India, it truly is a tragedy what is happening there. I think of India as sort of our cousin, and I think of it as the only actual secular democracy to exist in the the formerly colonized world, and to see it fall is truly a tragedy to my heart. And the revisionism, they're being painted. Aurangzeb is now simply just the bad guy. He is just the bad guy. And a couple of years ago, Akbar was actually sort of a good guy, you know, the good Muslim. But now he's not that anymore. Babur is this child rapist who destroyed mosques and all that, temples and all that. So yeah, historical revisionism in a horrible degree is happening there. And it's less about history, like I said, that we tend to look at history too often from an ideology perspective, and that's what's happening there. Like a lot of liberals, even the right wing has bombarded people with so much propaganda that some points have been conceded. Like even the most liberal Hindus now genuinely believe that Alauddin Khilji attacked the Nalanda University and destroyed the so-called Indian Golden Age, and that Mahmud of Ghazni attacked Somnath Mandir and then took it and all that wealth and stuff like that. So people genuinely believe that, because even liberals, people who don't support the BJP, they agree to that, this sort of revisionism. And with all these Bollywood movies and all that, it truly is terrible what's happening there.
I mean, they are doing like a proper like propaganda. Like I haven't watched any of those movies, but like I've heard about it like from some friends, and like recently they made a movie on Prithviraj Chauhan.
Yes.
Before that, they made a movie about against like Alauddin Khilji. Like
yes, Padmavat.
What was the name of that?
Padmavat.
Yeah, Padmavat. Yeah, exactly. But okay, let me rephrase this question as like in a different perspective. So we come from Pakistan, and there are so many Muslims who are living in India as well, like, or the Muslims of India, or historically the Muslims of Hindustan.
Mm-hmm.
So like we are actually the people of this region, the Indian subcontinent historically. And then there comes like invaders, like the Mahmud of Ghaznavi, who invaded Somnath 17 times. There comes Ghori. There comes Muhammad bin Qasim, who is from Arabia. And I mean, from our perspective, they are our invaders. And then why should we glorify them like our invaders? Like, why isn't Prithviraj Chauhan our hero and Ghori our villain? Or even like if we go back in history, like that is another argument as well. But like Alexander is still like people still name their kids as Sikandar, but like the guy who fought against Raja Porus against Alexander, nobody even like remembers his name.
Invaders. Now that's an interesting term. How is Mahmud of Ghazni attacking Somnath, or Babur attacking Delhi any different than any other Indian king attacking another Indian king? That's really not different. I think of invaders as people like Temur, who entered Delhi, who sacked Delhi, who took its wealth back to Samarkand, or the British, who came to our country. They developed infrastructure that they needed. They extracted our wealth and took it back to England. But people who came from outside, who genuinely ruled our region, and then they left a cultural legacy, I don't think of them as any worse than any other king. Coming back to Prithviraj Chauhan, in the movie, I have only seen the trailer, but in the movie you can clearly see that the good guys have these beautiful saffron turbans, and the bad guys, who look very evil, have these green turbans, and they're very clearly distinguished. This is Muslim bad, Hindu good. But at the time, the Sanskrit sources that we have, they don't call them Hindu or Muslim. They call the invaders Turushka, Turks, not Muslim, not Hindu, Turks. They talk about their ethnicity. For us, I think it's okay for us to have to sort of think of all of them as our forebearers, not exactly heroes. I don't think that we should think of anybody as heroes, to be honest, but as our people, like Babur is as Indian as, for example, Prithviraj Chauhan is, and Akbar and Alauddin Khilji. All these people, for example, Alauddin Khilji, he defended India against the Mongols. If the Mongols had entered, what they did in Lahore in, I think, 1230, the stuff that they did there, if they had done that to Delhi, would have taken 200 years to recover from this horrible event. So we should not really call them invaders or to sort of distinguish them. Look at Spain. They genuinely, it was a foreign power that entered of different religion, and then they conquered this region. People died, obviously, during warfare, as people do. But then they gave so much to the region. They embraced the region. They loved the people. The Mughals did the same in India. So we should think of that more than invaders. I mean, Somnath, you talk about Somnath. Mahmud of Ghazni attacked Somnath, and then he took its gates with him back to Ghazni. Only a few years before that, a Raja of the south, the Chola Empire, he attacked Bengal, and he destroyed a couple of temples there, a couple of huge temples that had been built by, I think, the Pala Empire, because temples were sort of the symbol of the grand power of the emperor. So when Hindu kings attacked each other, they destroyed their temples. But we only read about one raid. We read about Mahmud of Ghazni's raid on Somnath, not about the southern king Chola king's raid on Bengal, and which was equally destructive, which was equally bloody. But yeah, we just think of foreigners as foreigners are somehow worse than other Indians. I mean, how exactly is, for me as a Punjabi, how exactly is being attacked by a Bengali different than being attacked by someone from Afghanistan?
No, okay, like let's, for the sake of argument, we say like, okay, someone comes from Sindh, and then there is Raja Dahir, who is defending the Sindhis against a foreign invader who came from Arabia, sent by Hajjaj, his nephew, Muhammad bin Qasim. Do you think his hero should be Muhammad bin Qasim, or it should be Raja Dahir?
Neither. There's really no need for us to have heroes. Do we have need for that?
Is William Wallace not a hero for the Scots?
Why should, well, in his case it's kind of different, but again, why should we have these heroes? We are totally different people than they were. Our cultures are totally different. To be Sindhi is, back then, my people would have called themselves Sindhi, even though I come from Punjab, because everything has changed. Do we really need to have heroes? We should have heroes in the modern era who have, like, people who were founding fathers of Pakistan or founding fathers of India. We should have these heroes rather than look back behind in history and lose the context of the whole situation. Like, exactly, Raja Dahir, you might say that he was defending, but was Raja Dahir not a tyrant? Was it not Indians? Was it not Sindhi? Was it not the Jat who helped Muhammad bin Qasim? Was it not the locals who helped these invaders who joined their armies, who helped them defeat the locals? There was a lot of nuance, but we lose a lot of context when we look so back into the past.
No, but like, then again, this argument like comes to the point, like, okay, is our identity, like, are you a Punjabi, or is someone a Sindhi, or like, first we are Muslims, like, okay, then we have like, okay, sport like Muhammad bin Qasim, like, because he was a Muslim, he introduced us to Islam, like he gave us the biggest gift, like in like that could have been possible. I mean, it's also like difference from a perspective, like right now, like there's so many like nationalists in Sindh, like who are continuously, like, I mean, I remember like there was a debate like a couple of like months ago, like people were saying like, why is Muhammad bin Qasim my hero, why isn't like Raja Dahir my hero?
Again, I really don't think either should be anybody's hero. But yeah, people tend to focus more on religion. But I think in Punjab, that's a little bit less. Like, people don't hate the Sikhs for that. I mean, some do, but like if you put, well, we did put a statue of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, and somebody took it down. But yeah, people too often focus on religion. Like, that's the point, that when you look so back into the history to find a hero, and by the way, the hero is always an invader or a defender. It's never a scientist, or never somebody who, for common man, it really doesn't make a difference who is ruling you. Oftentimes people preferred, with Spain as well, locals helped Muslims come into power because the local king, who was a Christian, was such a tyrant. And same things happened in reverse as well, many times with the Mongols, for example. So it's we should not look back that much to, if you want to highlight a Sindhi, for example, to choose as a hero, you should find some writers or poets or stuff like that. Usually not. We should, as a civilization, if we focus on conquerors and warriors, where does that take us, to be honest?